Hello lovelies, and Happy New Year to you too. Let's kick off the year by looking at something of an indie darling for the last year, possibly two. Mothership, because the boxed set came out again and people were so keen on it, I thought I would buy in. Spoiler alert, I wasn't as impressed as a lot of other people, unfortunately, though that may not necessarily be reflected in the scores, because I try to be a bit more forgiving and objective than going purely on personal taste. Since it's a new year, let's just review briefly how I review. I give games two scores: style and substance. Style is a measure of the writing, the art, the je ne sais quoi, the how well it conveys itself, well, stylistically, hence style. The substance score is a measure of how much you get for your money, how much is contained within the game. That could be a little, it could be a lot. It's just making sure that there is everything there excuse me, that you might need. You know, whether it covers all the bases, has enough background, all of that sort of stuff for you to get going, right? I give each one a score 1 to 5. 3 is the average, so, and then I add the two together and divide again to give you a final score. And I use the full range. A lot of reviews, the average score tends to be about a 7. This is due to nefarious influences by various companies threatening to withdraw access, things like that, when you're talking about computer games, and so that has created a rather unrealistic idea of what scores should be. So anything 5 or 6 out of 10, 3 out of 5 or higher, is pretty good. Anything lower is pretty bad. If it's a genre or a system or something that you really like, then a score of 3 is sufficient to consider getting it. 4 out of 5 is really good. 5 out of 5 is outstanding, at least in my measure. Okay, so just keep that in mind going forward and for other reviews in the future. So this is the boxed set of Mothership. It's a fairly small box, and as a box it suffers from VAT here in the UK, so that makes it more expensive than it really needs to be. You get a bunch of stuff. You get some dice, you get some little standy things for cards, you get access to an app, the Mothership Companion, which lets you roll dice, generate characters with a single click, which is useful if they die constantly, and so on. More about this in a minute. You get some matte card covered booklets, adventure ideas, proper adventure, spaceship rules, player survival guide, warden, that's the games master, their operations manual, a little mini DM screen that is useless as a DM screen but useful as a reference sheet. You get a fold out poster thingy for starship stuff and combat stuff, and you get a bunch of cardstock characters, ships, gribblies and blips. Okay, most of that I will probably never use because I much prefer Theatre of the Mind. So let's get those bits of faff out of the way. Right, and that leaves us with the booklets. So the chief source of annoyance, I suppose, with the production value is these cardstock covers, which won't stand up to repeated reference, in my experience, and that's the chief problem buying a lot of old retro stuff, genuinely retro stuff, is that so many of the covers were thin cardstock and therefore don't stand up. It's also a problem with a lot of print on demand. If the covers are cheaply printed and you live in a very damp or a very dry environment, then they tend to curl and so on. These are gonna be not particularly resistant to being folded if that should happen, and God forbid anything gets spilt on them, because without any bond or coating, they're just going to soak it straight up. So it's not going to stand up to repeated reference, unfortunately. Now, fortunately, there is the app, but how long do apps stay available? There are board games out there that were very much tied into apps, and unfortunately some of those now lack their apps, which means that a fairly expensive piece of table furniture is now just a piece of table furniture and not a game. Now, you don't need the app, so less of a problem, but I am always wary of anything that directs you towards using an app or a website, or where that aids the flow of the game so enormously that without it you would slow everything down and make everything a bit more difficult. Now, this is a relatively simple system, so you don't especially need the app or so on. It just helps a little bit, so it's not a huge problem here, but for some people that's a deal breaker, and for me it's a source of worry. As for the game itself, as we begin to leaf through, I don't have a huge amount to say, which is why I've been padding this review out already. You have 4 statistics: strength, speed, intelligence, and combat. These don't vary very much as you create your character. You get these stats at 2d10 plus 25. So that gives you a variance between 27 and 45, which isn't very much, really. It reminds me, albeit there are a lot less stats, of the kind of degree of starting area of statistics and so on that Warhammer Fantasy roleplay characters get. You're lucky to have a stat at 30, which equals 30% in Warhammer Fantasy roleplay, or the earlier iterations of Warhammer 40,000 games. Yeah. So that kind of sets you up for failure to a degree, which is fine because that fits the setting and everything. But don't be expecting your characters to be especially competent, and don't be expecting one character to be particularly competent compared to the others. You also get 3 saves, and your saves are sanity, fear, and body, and those are only at 2d10 plus 10. So you're going to be maxing out at 30 with those. It is class based. Boo, we don't like classes. And the base classes are Marine, Android, Scientist, and Teamster. Teamster's a very American term. Blue collar is slightly better, slightly more universal, but fair enough. It's a little linguistic tick. And when you're setting something in the future, multiplanetary and so on, maybe you want to genericize the language a little bit more. Your class gives you access to certain special capabilities, alters various things about how things work, and boosts your stats a little, but don't get excited because it's not by much. You start basically with 1d10 plus 10 for your health points. These work basically like hit points, kind of, and each time you run out of health, you take a wound. For reference, a revolver does 1d10 plus 1 damage. Each class can take a different number of wounds. You gain a wound when your health reaches 0. This makes you tougher than I would think for a horror-based game, especially when you factor armor into the whole thing. So characters aren't as fragile as you might first think necessarily. I'm not sure how that fits with the vibe particularly. You have set trauma responses based on your class, which is okay, but I'd open it up a bit more and allow players to choose their own trauma responses. This is similar to solutions I've come up with, because the problem with fear and frenzy and other similar effects upon characters is that they rob players of agency and characters of agency. If you let people choose a bit more, which you kind of do through class here, that means you've got a choice in how your character goes mad or how your character responds to fear or whatever, and that returns a little bit of agency, and anything that happens is your own fault, and that works, generally speaking, a lot better in my experience. Rolls are done against statistics or stat plus skill, and skills are nested. So plus 10 for basic skills, plus 15 for expert skills, which are narrower, and plus 20 for master skills, which are narrower still, which is similar to some other ideas I've had about skills. So overall I approve of that. You have to get some basic skills before you can get some expert skills, before you can get some master skills. That's how it works. Rolls are done against either your stats or your stat plus skill. A roll of 99 to 100 is always a failure, which isn't terribly great, and you gain stress when you fail, and that's what tips you over into madness or fear or whatever else. Doubles and a success is a critical success, doubles and a failure is a critical failure, so it's quite swingy despite having the superficial appearance of a percentile based system. Advantage or disadvantage, you roll twice, you take the best or you take the worst. And that's basically it. Sorry about that coughing fit. So yeah, like I said, that's pretty much it. There's some other things we need to talk about here, though. So presentation-wise, black and white, fairly sketchy. I have no issue with that. Some of it is Scrap Princess art or Scrap Princess style art. If you've looked into Veins of the Earth, whatever it's called, that I'm not a huge fan of that style of art, but it can be kind of evocative and fitting, and most of the artwork through this is pretty evocative and fitting. It's cassette futurism by way of biro doodles on your school textbook sort of thing, and I quite like that as a style. In terms of writing presentation, the layout can be a bit jumbly and confusing, which makes referencing things a little bit difficult here and there. It took me an embarrassingly long time to find the reference on what the different class bonuses were, just because it all kind of blurred into one quite a bit. Mind you, I was ill at the time, so maybe that's part of it. This is a horror game, and yet several times we find these sorts of reminders, and it's here in the terms of use on the back of the Warden's operations book. Prioritize the safety and fun of your players, it says. Over everything else, the story rules, challenge, balance, it all takes a back seat to making sure everyone is comfortable and enjoying themselves. Now, enjoyment can mean a lot of things, and when it comes to the horror genre, enjoyment comes from experiencing disgust, fear, all of those kinds of emotions and reactions that we normally think of as negative, that become exhilarating and exciting in an inherently safe context, like a roller coaster or a tabletop game, which is inherently safe and cannot hurt you at any point. And overcoming the horror, overcoming the imbalance, overcoming the challenge, being uncomfortable in a safe environment, these are all good things. Now, to an extent, this is just meaningless genuflection to current obsessions within the culture, and particularly in the indie RPG culture. But that doesn't make it any more excusable to keep doing this, especially when it comes to a horror game where that is the antithesis of what horror is about. And so that rather desperately undermines the idea that is otherwise put forward in the game, that, you know, things are deadly, characters are going to die, things are hard, you're going to fail, and so on. Right? It's an issue that undermines the whole game, in my opinion. And increasingly I'm of the thought that, you know, this is just as meaningless as the old "this is not satanic, you can't really learn spells" disclaimers we used to get in games. But when it runs directly opposite to the goal and idea of the game, then I think it's still a problem. Spaceship rules are pretty simple. I don't think I need to go over them, especially because the meat and potatoes of the game is not ship-to-ship combat, which is not horrifying in the same sort of way. It's when you get down and personal. I mean, substance-wise, there is everything here basically that you need, but it is not. It's the similar sort of problem to Morkborg in that it is too simple. If you want to do cool stuff, TM, the framework isn't really there for you to do it outside of the GM saying, "Oh, advantage or disadvantage," and then kind of spitballing what happens. So that's a bit of an absence and a problem as well, and it wouldn't have taken much to overcome that. Alright then, it's one final thing we have to ask about before we get to the scores, and that is, why would you play Mothership rather than the Alien RPG? Well, characters in this are slightly more competent than they are under the Year Zero engine, so there's that. The stress system here is slightly better and makes slightly more sense than the one in the Alien system. Mothership is not tied to a set and specific universe, which is good. It gives you a lot more freedom. I feel like the Alien RPG, while probably overall a superior system and presented in a better, more professional way, is far too tied to the Alien universe, which is far less engaging and interesting as Alien prequels continue. Yeah, Prometheus and its ilk have kind of ruined my enthusiasm for Alien. So you can use this to do things like Life Force or Dead Space, you know, and it certainly has you kind of covered for a lot of these. You can, you know, going through this booklet, which is Unconfirmed Contact Reports, you can certainly find lots of inspiration here. They don't especially go deep into the stats, though you do have them. They're just a single line. But the ideas are there, and you can recognise a lot of them from different sci-fi films, books, and so on. And it certainly has the space for you to, well, no pun intended, for you to try different monsters and things. The adventures are just basically a waste of time for me. I still just don't like adventures, especially as part of a core game. It feels extraneous to me. It's something that you can only ever use once. It feels like a waste of space and time and money. Your mileage may vary, but I am adventure hostile when it comes to including them in games. Alright then, so let's give this thing some sort of score, shall we? Style-wise, I'm going to give it a 4, but a low 4. And I'm giving it that 4 out of 5 because a lot of the artwork isn't to my taste, but I think it is fitting, and it definitely has an overall visual identity that runs through the whole game, and that is a good thing when you compare and contrast a lot of indie games to a lot of mainstream games like Dungeons and Dragons. The indie games have a much stronger visual story and a much stronger visual consistency to them, which is good. The writing is mostly good. It's knocked down a bit because I think this art style is a Marmite art style. You either love it or you hate it. I'm trying to be understanding and appreciative of what it's trying to do here, but part of the knockdown is because the art is very much dependent on the viewer, and the other problem is the repeated emphasis on safety tools and so on. You know, normally it's just a genuflection, who cares? But here it directly undermines the point and focus of the game. In terms of substance, everything is there that you need. There isn't a particularly set universe, which is good or bad depending on how you want to think about it. The rules feel somewhat incomplete in that I can see a lot of improvisation needing to be done at the table, and that's very old school, sure, but it's nice to have some sort of guideline for those sorts of things, even if it's a very loose one, to help you channel your ideas. The rules are sufficient, but lacking if you want to stretch your legs and your imagination and do something a bit more expansive. It is a very prescriptive sort of game, not as bad as Japanese games, which tell you how to do everything, but it is very much a set sort of procedure of how you do things in this game. So substance, yeah, a high 3. So 4 plus 3, 7 out of 10, 3.5 out of 5. If you like sci-fi horror, it's worth getting. If you liked the idea of Alien, the RPG, but didn't really vibe with it in the way that you wanted to, probably a good idea. Old school gamers who want some sci-fi action might appreciate this as well, but expect to die unless you can successfully manipulate your warden by invoking the safety rules. Zang. A problem for every games master has always been coming up with adventure ideas. For years now, Postmortem Studios has been helping out with the 100 Adventure Seeds line. These provide adventure ideas for all genres, and you can get them at RPG Now or lulu.com.